Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Peak Human Podcast. I'm Brian Sanders. This is the podcast where you go back, find all the old good episodes because, yes, they're still good. I make sure each one is good. I make sure I have the best guests I can get. I actually would always love guest suggestions. I take them all seriously, research them, vet them, and then maybe do an episode. So please go back, listen since episode 1 even, all the way from the beginning. Reach out to me, Food Lies on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, wherever. You can find me if you search for Food Lies. Give me feedback. Would love to hear from you. Today I'm talking to Amber O'Hearn. She is a long-time carnivore diet eater. Very interesting, very bright. She has written many academic papers, even though she's not a PhD. She's very smart, very reasonable. I think you're going to enjoy this episode because I am endlessly fascinated with people who only eat meat. People think I'm a carnivore. I'm not. I'm 80% animal foods. If you look at my calories, which I have done once and only once, I do think many people have had great benefits from eating a plant-free diet. And like I said, it's so interesting to me why it works, how it works, plant anti-nutrients, what's going on in the gut. So many questions are answered in this episode. We explore a lot of things. I still can't figure out where I stand on long-term carnivore. I think it's great short-term, but I just don't quite get it long-term. But you'll see in this episode, we get into it. I choose very specific plant foods that I eat with my meat that I think are the safest, the best for humans, the easiest to digest. I'll leave the rest for the episode. A little bit more about my guest today. Amber O'Hearn has an eclectic background with academic publications in several fields, including theoretical mathematics, cognitive psychology, computational linguistics, and more recently, evolutionary nutrition and biology. She has been studying and experimenting with low-carb ketogenic diets since 1997 and is particularly interested in evolutionary constraints and interspecies differences. Amber has been eating a nearly plant-free diet since 2009. She's been at it for a while. She also reversed her bipolar disease, which is crazy to hear her talk about. So before we begin, I want to talk about my company, Nose to Tail. This is how this podcast is possible. This is how we support our local ranchers here in Texas. We have 4 families raising all the animals, getting them straight from the processor to you, to your door. We deliver to 48 states. We have all the fresh meat, lamb, bison, beef, chicken, pork, the chicken and pork, pasture raised, low PUFA diet, no corn, no soy, organic, all the beef, lamb, bison, grass finish, out on wild rangeland, rotated, moved around. We're focusing on regeneration of land, soil health. We're doing all the good things. It's not the cheapest, but it's the best. It's the best, I tell you. We have all the nose to tail items as well, like our primal bone broth, our primal ground beef with the organs mixed in. We have bone marrow canoes. We have organs. We have all kinds of things. Check out our site, nosetotale.org. Make yourself a box. We pay for half your shipping. Meat prices are going up. Everything's going up, but you can still get it from us. Still reasonable prices for the quality of food you're getting. Supporting the local ranchers. That's at nosetotale.org. Check out our other products. Biltong, Livervores. Livervores is behind me if you're watching the YouTube version of this. It is a stick of dried meat, air dried at a low temperature, no sugar, no curing agents, just some vinegar. It has 30% liver mixed in. Great stuff. Get your organ meats on the go. I love trying to find ways to sneak organ meats into the diet. We also have the body care, just retopping off on some more skin food. That stuff will sell out immediately, so you have to catch it when it's there. It's this amazing whipped texture. It's made from beef tallow. We get only the best suet from grass-fed animals, from regenerative ranches that my guy Tommy collects by hand, renders, makes it into this amazing product. I'm telling you, your skin just soaks it up. One time I stayed out too long in the sun, 5 hours, midday, Texas heat, got a little red, put it on, completely went away, turned into a tan, no sunburn, no peeling. It was amazing. The stuff is so good. The soap, absolutely amazing. The only thing I use, lip balm. This is what your skin wants. It's beef tallow. It's similar to your saturated fat that your body's made of. No extra ingredients, just what you need, nothing more. So check it out, nosetotale.org. Of course, we got the seasonings, we got hats, we got a few other things there. Check it out. nosetotale.org. Free shipping on the other stuff, not the meat, on the other items if you spend over $60. Thanks so much for supporting us. We're a small business. We're opening up here in Austin. We have a little retail place. the Sapien compound that I talk about a lot. Construction is on its way. We should be having our first event July 7th, right before KetoCon. I'll update everyone if they go to sapien.org, get on the email list, put yourself on the Sapien newsletter list, and you will get information each week, little updates, insights, just good stuff, nothing more. Thanks so much, everyone. The community is so awesome, supporting me online at my Food Lies content, waiting for the film patiently, which we work on every day. So exciting. Get to show a preview at KetoCon of the film. Everyone's so supportive, Nose to Tail, and all my family ranchers, nosetotatail.org. And thanks so much, and please enjoy the show with Amber. Hello, hello. How are you doing, Amber?
Hi, doing great. How are you?
I am great. I'm great. I always ask people where they're calling in from.
I'm coming from sunny Colorado.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I've only been there once or twice, so I'll have to come back soon.
It's beautiful. A little stark. We don't have quite the moisture as you have on the coast.
Yeah, well, now I'm in Austin.
Ah.
So now I'm in Austin. I grew up in Hawaii, then I got to California, then I made my way to Austin, and I love it here. So we're gonna have some events here. Maybe we can get you here. I just signed the lease and got access to our property, so we're gonna have our own ancestral health headquarters here in Austin, where we're gonna have events and do all kinds of things. So yeah,
Fun.
welcome.
Thank you.
Whenever. Okay, well, give us some background. I always like the guests to do that for themselves. And why should we listen to you? Why? What credentials do you have? No, sorry. And just to put it out there, I mean, I'm just an engineer. I don't have credentials in the health world, and I think that you don't necessarily need them. So please tell us.
Well, my background actually academically is also, it's not engineering precisely, but I studied math and computer science and linguistics. And so my initial upbringing wasn't so much in nutrition, but by this point I've been studying nutrition for so long that not only have I been speaking about it at conferences, I've written journal papers, and so I'm not exactly just an off the street person who's interested in low carb, but it did start that way. I'm the kind of person who can't keep my head out of the books once I get really interested in an idea.
That's great. So yes, you speak at many conferences, you've written papers, you're not just some random person telling their experience.
True, although experience is maybe a little bit underrated. It gets a bad rap because, I mean, it's true that you can draw bad conclusions based on personal experience because you don't necessarily know what all the factors involved are. So it can be a pitfall. But well, I started low carb actually back in 1997, so almost a quarter century ago, when I was in my 20s. And before that point, I had actually been, well, I had been vegetarian and even vegan at certain points in my life. I was brought up vegetarian or mostly vegetarian. And so when I started having actually weight problems in my early 20s, my first, my intuition that had developed from that kind of cultural influence was that going to a less meat diet and a more vegetable centric diet would be the solution to that. And I read books on it, but I was I wasn't very critical because I think because the books were telling me what I already believed, and so it didn't take a lot of persuasion. So when I first heard of low carb, actually, and it was years before I tried it, after first hearing about it, I thought that's just stupid and crazy. Like, why would you throw away complex carbohydrates, which are the base of the whole human diet? And I didn't really give it much more thought until the point at which the ideas that I had weren't serving me, and I had to eventually realize that maybe there was something else going on and that I'd better reconsider. And even then, so then I was on a low carb diet for 12 years before I became a carnivore. and and it kind of went kicking and screaming. Like, I thought, all right, maybe this will help me, because low carb actually was really good for me at first. I lost weight and I maintained it for a long time, but I don't know if it was because of aging, because of multiple pregnancies, and I gained a lot of weight on my pregnancies and never quite got back to where I was. But I was also on antidepressants because I had been diagnosed with major depressive disorder back when I was 20. And now I think that antidepressants might have had something to do with the failure of diet to keep me at the weight I wanted. I'm not sure, but all I know is that by the end of 2008, I was the highest weight I had ever been, probably 200 pounds. I stopped weighing after about 195, and I'm 5'6", to put that in context. And so I'd been studying the low carb diet for 12 years, and I was really persuaded that adding back carbs would not be a solution. But when I came across some people who were actually eating a diet that was low carb, but also no vegetables, my first thought was, well, that's a little bit crazy, but maybe since it's helped them, it could help me, and I'll just do it temporarily. Like, I was really thinking of it as a diet, in the sense of, I'm going to do this thing just to get to my goal, and then I'll go back to what I was doing, and maybe I'll maintain it better. And it took me a long time, actually, even to work up the courage to try it, because vegetables were a real mainstay of my diet. I believed that they were healthy. I enjoyed them a lot. I wasn't one of those people who thought, oh, any excuse to give up vegetables will make me happy. I really enjoyed them. I probably still would even now, but I thought I'd try it. And not only did the weight just start coming off really quickly, which was my vanity-based goal, but it started improving my mood. And that was really huge. Now, by that time, I had actually been re-diagnosed from major depressive disorder to a form of bipolar disorder, bipolar type 2, which is characterized by a lot more of the depressive side. So it can be kind of masked by a diagnosis of depression, because I never had manias. Like the normal type 1 bipolar, you alternate from deep depression to psychotic breaks with mania. And I didn't have that part, and I didn't realize, and I think probably a lot of people don't realize, that you don't need to have that to have a bipolar diagnosis. So I had tried different meds because of the new diagnosis. Now, that's a long-term kind of chronic condition, and no one expects that kind of condition to just go away. Like, it's considered incurable if you have that kind of depressive disorder, just like arthritis might be considered incurable. It's something you manage, but you don't cure. And it's also long-term. It has these long-term swings. And again, a comparison with arthritis might be warranted, because if your arthritis pain goes away for a while, you don't think, oh, well, I don't have arthritis anymore. You think, I'm in remission and it's going to come back. So when the carnivore diet was helpful to my mood, I didn't immediately think, well, I've cured my bipolar. I just thought, this is making me feel really good. And it was only years later, or at least months later, when I thought, this is actually really helping. I ended up, I've been off all meds for over a decade, and it absolutely changed my life. So the reason that I'm still on a carnivore diet, yes, it did address my weight problems at that time, but I think if it were only that, I would probably have developed ways to go back to my vegetable ways. But because it had such a profound effect on my mood, and really, you might as well say it saved my life, because I had a lot of suicidal periods, and who knows what would have happened. But because of that, that's why all these years later, I still use a carnivore diet for my health.
That's great. Yeah, I talked to Dr. Chris Palmer about some bipolar cases of healing, remission beyond that. I guess he would call them cures. So I guess I kind of didn't say this up front, unless people listen to the intro, that you are one of these long-term carnivores that have been doing it for quite a while, kind of a leading voice in the space, and that I wanted to have you on to discuss this, because I have such a nuanced relationship with carnivore, where I think it's so great and powerful, but then I also don't think we all need to be doing it, and I have all my reservations about it. Right. But I'm a huge supporter of it, but I'm also a critic of it. So it's such an interesting thing, such an interesting topic. I love talking about it. So that's what we're going to do today, is hear from you. Maybe you can see if you can, talk me into it. Maybe I'll do it again. I tried it for, I did it for 10 days once or something and a week once. And that's a whole different story. But I just love to discuss these issues and yeah, like dig into the nuances. So hopefully the audience is interested in this because you're one of the most experienced people out there. And yeah, let's do it. And let's start by talking about your experience. And it's been how long strict carnivore?
Well, I started in 2009, and it was kind of a wiggly path because about 3 weeks, I had decided actually I was going to try it for three weeks. I thought that would be long enough to see what kind of effect it would have, and I cleverly worked it out that the end of the 3-week period would end on my birthday, and so I thought I'd have some kind of keto cake thing to celebrate being 36. And by the time that birthday came, I was feeling so good and so into it. I was like, no way, I'm stopping. But then about a week later, I found out I was pregnant with my third child. And so I wasn't worried about the diet affecting the pregnancy because I had long since studied about ketosis in infants and in fetuses, and I wasn't worried about that kind of problem. But well, two things happened. one is I had to go off meds. At that time, I was on a very small amount of thyroid medication and a bipolar medication, and I went off those because of the pregnancy. And the other thing that happened was that I started craving carbohydrates absolutely intensely in a way that I hadn't, like even just low carb. I can remember sitting on the couch and just thinking about carbohydrate foods. And so I was kind of just white knuckling it and then one day I was like, screw it. And I went down to the nearest diner and I ate 3 carby breakfasts all at once. And I think that's really normal for the first trimester of pregnancy because what happens is your insulin goes way up because your body wants to fatten you to prepare you to be able to carry this baby. And so the typical trajectory is really high insulin fattening mode for the first trimester. And then by the third trimester, that has eased off because now you're transferring those fats to the baby. And so, to make a long story short, I didn't eat pure carnivore the first trimester or the second trimester, and I was starting to get back to it by the end. But as soon as the baby was born, I had been reading all that time and thinking about it and was excited about it. And as soon as the baby was born, I went back onto a plant-free diet, and I just never needed to take the meds again. So I think that was your question was how long have I been doing it? Yeah,
How
yeah.
long? Well,
So
yeah.
um, so it's been since then that I've been on this diet.
And then have you tried would that be the time that you tried to add back in foods and then the problems came back? Or have you tried to like add back in vegetables and then you had certain mental things that came back?
No, actually, and I think this is a really valid point and maybe even criticism about what I'm doing. So I am fairly certain that there are going to be some foods that don't disrupt this therapeutic effect for me because vegetables and plants are like this huge variety of things that classify that are classified as plants. And so and they all have different effects. So they're full of different kinds of anti-nutrients, polyphenols, things that are for them serve the role of trying not to be eaten. So, they're basically toxins that can have sometimes therapeutic effects. But all of them have different types. and some of them are more likely to be harmful than others. So seeds, for example, have to be highly protected because they're the way that the plant reproduces. And if all of your reproductive parts get eaten, you don't survive to the next generation. So only the plants that were able to defend that in a really strong way are the ones that are still around. I do know that there are some things that I seem to have no bad response to. For example, dill pickles I've eaten on numerous occasions by now over the last decade, and I've never had a bad response to that. But on the other hand, I did try psyllium once because there was this point where I was listening to a lot of people advocating for fiber, and I thought, well, maybe it would be better to have some fiber along with my diet. So I was taking this pure fiber, and I had a horrible response to that, like almost immediate um, kind of brain noise. Actually, I couldn't focus. The way that I felt is somehow reminds me of the way people describe uh, some combination between a panic attack and ADHD. Like all these, I was at work and I had stirred this into my coffee. Coffee is another plant product that I actually have had almost the whole time. Um, anyway, I couldn't, all of a sudden, all of the office noises started. I couldn't filter them out the way we normally are able to focus on what we're doing and all the other things that are going on around us. Our brain just naturally filters them out, and I couldn't do it. And I had a big emotional kind of breakdown for a few hours after that. And so I have tried some things along the way, and some of them have been perfectly fine, and some of them have not. But as to, really trying to work out what I could add back in, that's something that I definitely could do, and I think that there would be things that would be all right. But I actually feel so content with the way that I eat that I don't have a strong drive to try to figure out what those things are. And if I do encounter something that um, doesn't go over well, I feel like it's not worth the lost productivity and happiness of trying to figure out what it is, if that makes sense.
That's interesting. Yeah, because most people kind of have the opposite take, and they want to. Yeah, maybe they will do carnivore for a healing period, and then they just want to see how many foods they can add back in. But if you're content, then why? I guess there's no reason not to, unless we get into the other topics of yeah, nutrient deficiencies, all that stuff. I guess we can start getting into. There's so many topics. We can even start on plant anti-nutrients in case people aren't familiar with those. You started getting into that, but yeah, I want to cover a lot of informational stuff, not just ask you about your experience. So let's start with plant anti-nutrients then, because you're right. Plants want to protect themselves. They have chemicals. They make basically these pesticides that protect them. And I think a lot of people have benefits from cutting them out. And I have good friends who have crazy stories of just from nightshades. It's like cut out night was changed my life, completely changed my life. And all it was the nightshades,
Hmm.
right? And they can eat other foods and it's all good. So everyone has this individual response to these plant anti-nutrients, because immediately if you start talking to a normal person about plant anti-nutrients, they just look at you like you're an idiot. Like, humans have always eaten plants. Plants are wonderful. They're the fountain of youth and health, and everything about them is amazing. So yeah, let's dig in there.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, I didn't even think about this until after I started carnivore, and I heard Dr. Georgia Eid giving a presentation about plant anti-nutrients, and it kind of blew my mind because until that point, I hadn't come up with any really good plausible idea of why this should help at all. And it might not even be why, but I think it's a fairly decent hypothesis that there's something about those anti-nutrients that some people are unable to tolerate them and other people aren't. And that could have to do with intestinal permeability. So your body has to maintain its kind of biological definition of self. It has to decide whenever anything is passing through, is this something that is going to be part of me, or is this something that is definitely not self and I'm not letting in? And so your intestinal barrier is the first stop that prevents things from getting in that shouldn't be getting in. And in some people that it should be fairly impermeable to most things and only selectively permeable to the things that we want. And in some people, that permeability is a little bit less functional, and more things can get in than should normally be able to get in. And so one possible hypothesis for why some people really seem to benefit from a carnivore diet and other people doesn't seem to make all that much difference could be the health of the intestines, and whether or not the same toxins that you might expel very easily, someone else might be taking into their body and then have a lot more to cope with. And those barriers are kind of repeated throughout the body. So the first barrier might be intestinal, but there are barriers like the blood-brain barrier, where arguably if you've got some permeability going on in the intestines, then you may have actually what they call a leaky brain to go along with the leaky gut. So all plants have these, and our bodies, like you said, we've been eating plants for a long time now. The degree to which we're eating plant has varied from place to place and time to time. And I think that the idea that every person in our whole like Homo history was eating lots of plants is actually not really a very accurate picture. We were eating a lot of meat always, but plants are very seasonal. There aren't very many that aren't toxic. We have learned to take, for example, all of the cruciferous vegetables, which are not even nightshades but have their own problems. So like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, mustard, and all of those come basically from one set of wild plants that we didn't have that variety. We found that one that has limited toxicity that we are able to eat, and we like went crazy on it because that's one that can work. But most plants, the vast majority of plants, are not human edible. So there are very few that where the toxicity is low enough that we could actually use them. But because humans eventually, if you go far enough back, like a couple million years, our descendants or our ancestors, eventually, if you go back far enough, were primarily herbivorous. And all herbivorous animals have participated in this evolutionary arms race in which, yes, the plants are trying to prevent you from eating them, but I need to eat, so I'm going to learn how to detoxify that. And so it's this perpetual cycle of getting good at detoxifying and getting good at breaking through those detoxifying mechanisms. So we do absolutely have the ability to detoxify to some degree, but depending on your health condition and how the toxic load, so even just how much vegetables you're eating, but also other things that might be in your environment, can make you weaker and more susceptible to not faring well on a high load of plants.
Yeah, that's how I see it. And because then it kind of makes sense throughout history, especially when you bring in the intestinal permeability part. If we're talking about 100 years ago, we're also talking about a lot less plants. I'm actually looking at the food timeline of like what plants are introduced when, and it's amazing. Like broccolini was invented like 10 years ago or something. You know, these things are so new. We think that they're always around because you go to the Whole Foods and there's this huge rainbow 24/7 there, but that's not what it's like. And so to go back 100 years, if we're not eating all this crazy processed food, all the seed oils, all the Monsanto soaked, monocropped grains, our intestines probably were a lot more robust, intact, and we could handle a lot of things. Even 50 years ago, we could probably handle a lot more things. But now I think there's so many things attacking our guts that it's hard for people to be able to tolerate a lot of plants. And then we're talking about the volume. Yes, I think the volume's a consideration, and even the seasonality, right? It's like I got caught in the spinach and kale shake thing for years, and that's not natural. If you're blending a bunch of spinach and kale, there's so many oxalates. It's just an oxalate bomb. I even had the almond milk in there for more oxalates. And so I'm just drinking this oxalate sludge every day, 365 days a year. That's not what humans ever did, right? You're talking about seasonality. Like, yeah, maybe if we did eat seasonally, and again, same thing, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, we had to eat seasonally. We didn't have It wasn't like rampant shipping lines and logistics that got us all these things year round. So we could detox. We had maybe the kale. Well, we didn't have kale. That's another one that's new. Uh, we we could have certain foods, but then our body got the rest from them. Do you kind of see it that way too?
Yes, yes. And it sounds maybe overblown, like what's the problem with oxalates, but I mean, there's actually a case study of someone who was hospitalized and with kidney malfunction from exactly doing that, having heavy oxalate-laden shakes every day as a presumably as a in the hopes of improving their health, and it did exactly the opposite. But yeah, I mean, animals, both domestic animals and animals in the wild, what they typically do is they'll rotate foods. They have this, they're able to sense when they've had too much of one kind of food, and that's why I think that you always hear about balancing your diet, and balancing your diet is really, really important if you're an herbivore because in part because of the toxins, if you rotate what toxins you're getting and manage that toxic load, it can be easier for you to detoxify. And then there's also on the flip side of that, there's the nutrient coverage because each plant has its own complement of nutrients, but it isn't ever the full complement that an animal would need. And so you need to balance in order to get coverage of your nutrients too. And these concerns don't really apply when you're eating meat because in meat, what you've done is you've let the herbivorous animal do the job of detoxifying for you, such that by the time you're eating their flesh, there's very little, there are only trace amounts left of those biochemicals that they did the work of detoxifying for you, and all you have left is the nutrients that they biosynthesized. It's really a whole different picture. Um, and then on the other side of that is that because we have so much in common biochemically with animals, the nutrients that they need are very often very similar in quantity and quality to the nutrients that we need. And so when you eat their flesh, you're basically getting a prepared set of nutrients that match our biochemical needs, which makes animal source foods so much higher quality. And there's yes, you may need to be careful of certain outlier things that you need to get, but for the most part, you get everything in one package.
Yeah, and it's bioavailable. It's all what we need because yes, exactly what you said. So, well, let's go more to plants before we get to how great
Okay,
meat is.
sure.
So, yeah, plants. Yeah, I love the mustard plant too. Yeah, the all cruciferous vegetables we have, including kale and Brussels sprouts and the other ones you listed, came from this tiny little mustard plant. And so that humans, yeah, I mean, yeah, we could find it, but it wasn't like we were just making our meals of these little weeds that we found here and there. But then, maybe there was more fruit. Fruit is another story that it's not as protected, right? The plants want the fruit to be eaten. And so a lot of people are doing well on this new type of diet. It's like carnivore plus fruit.
Yeah,
Well, I guess we can take a break for a second and I can ask you about that. What do you think
sure.
about
Well,
that?
it's not really new because it's basically, if you've heard of Ray Peat, Ray Peat has been advocating for a fruit plus high saturated fat meat diet for at least as long as I've been in the carnivore community. So I think it's recently become popular because some of the carnivores have started turning toward Ray Peat ideas, um, but there have been people doing that and advocating that for a while. I want to skip back to something you said about fruit being not so defended. It's true and it's not true. The fruit is definitely a lure because a plant is using other animals to distribute their seeds. And so what they want is an animal that's going to swallow the thing whole and deposit the seed. So they're targeting very specific animals. And the lure is the sugar, which if it's in limited context is probably not a problem. Um, but they do have to defend it very, very carefully to make sure that it gets to maturity. So an unripe fruit is full, it's very bitter and we don't like it. And bitterness is the big toxicity signal, right? So that's how we know not to eat something toxic. And that's, so that's what an unripe fruit would be. So it's really important for the plant that the seed is not eaten too early. And so it stays very toxic until it's ready, and all the plant has to do is reduce the toxins enough that it's worth it to the animal to make the trade-off. So it doesn't have to be free of toxins, it just has to be low enough toxins that you can deal with it and be worth the high energy load that you're going to get. So there's a story of it's waxwing birds, and I can't remember exactly what kind of fruit it is, but I read a paper about how the fruit becomes available, but the birds will not eat it until another kind of plant that has a very protein heavy thing that they can eat becomes available. And as soon as they can eat that, then the protein in that gives them enough basically
The trade-offs,
yeah,
or
it gives them the ability with bicarbonates. That's the word I was searching for. The bicarbonates from the
oh,
protein gives them the
mhm.
ability to detox that fruit. So there's still toxins there, but it's lower, and the energy load becomes worth it because you need to get energy from somewhere, and so fructose. Um, I think there's a lot of evidence that it wasn't available in very high amounts in our past, such that we were able to make use of whatever fructose was there. There's basically no limit to how much you would eat if you found it, because it's naturally limited in the environment. And that fructose is really effective at fattening you, and that's actually a good thing if it's rare, because you're going to use that for the time when the fructose is gone and other sources of energy are less available. But now, so now we have fruit available all year round. We have worked to breed species and to bring in species that have the highest sugar load and the lowest fiber load that we can make them bear. And when that becomes available all year round, it's not clear to me that adding fruit to a carnivorous diet is going to support the health of everyone if it's in this unlimited way. And of course, especially if you have any kind of sign of metabolic syndrome, adding extra sugars is probably not going to serve you.
Yeah, there's way more context to it. I've noticed that the guys, it seems like most, no, there's definitely women, never mind. The people who do the meat plus fruit are usually like very active younger people, and they do well on it. And even around Austin, that's what I see. It's like all these like young fit dudes just crushing meat and fruit and thinking it's great. And I mean, yeah, it works for me too. I don't eat tons of fruit, but it's, I do enjoy adding some of this fruit in as like a dessert, and it's after my workout, and it's great. But I also see what you're saying is that, yeah, we didn't have it year round, or yes, if we found like a thing of honey and it was this big thing and we ate it and it was great and we got calories, and then we didn't always have that. And so it could cause problems. Also, like you gave Ray Pete a shout out. Yeah, people have been kind of bringing him up to me for many years, and I kind of had this slow thing where I was like, oh, this is very interesting. He was first onto this kind of like no PUFA thing. He's like, no, we don't want the PUFAs. We want saturated fat. And he's done some interesting work. And I think more people need to give him credit that he's the one that's been, talking about this for many, many years. And I have done some podcasts with people we've talked about Ray Pete and his stuff. So you can go back and listen to those. But yeah, that is interesting. So what about what about anti-nutrients? I actually didn't know if there's that many sort of anti-nutrients in fruits. Like, do you think these are a problem other than just having a lot of sugar and fructose?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the anti-nutrients, because they're toxins, can actually be medicinally valuable at a certain level. So you have this hormetic effect with a toxin, and a lot of herbal drugs and even some pharmaceutical drugs work in this way, where a little bit seems to be good because what it does is it immediately stimulates your immune system. Like your immune system sees it and says, whoa, no, we don't want that. It tries its hardest not to absorb it. And then insofar as it does absorb, what it does is it sets off this defense system, which triggers endogenous antioxidants and other things that in small quantities, the net effect of that can actually be healthy. But when you get beyond that and the toxic load starts to get too high, it overwhelms the capability of the system to respond appropriately to that immune response, or to that immune trigger. And so, for example, there are drugs that are based on this that we use in cancer, uh, specifically to act in the same way as a lot of antinutrients do to trigger our immune system and get a higher cascade of our own endogenous defenses going. But they've found that if you're not careful, the dose quickly actually results in worse outcomes than if you hadn't had it in the first place. And I think that it's very difficult to determine what dose is going to be helpful and what's not. Usually in plant foods, actually, the dose is so small that that toxicity it isn't going to be triggered, which means the benefit isn't going to be triggered. So, for example, the best bioavailable food-based hormetic component that we know of is sulforaphane, which is in those cruciferous vegetables. Broccoli sprouts are the highest. But even with that, because it degrades very quickly and because there are other enzymes in the plant that can prevent it from acting, and because it's just small in the first place, it could take pounds of, and cooking destroys it too, so like pounds of raw broccoli sprouts every day to get that potentially therapeutic benefit that we don't really even know what dose is good and what dose is bad. And so when we want to get medicinal effects from plants, the only really surefire way to get it is to get, supplements that have it concentrated, isolated and concentrated. So you can have something like curcuminoids that have been isolated and concentrated, and quercetin and sulforaphane. But the best way to do that is really through a pill, so that you can make sure that you're getting the right dose. So I don't know. I feel like there's an argument on both sides. Like if it's going to be good for you or bad for you, you have to be either susceptible for some reason in your own body, or in which case it seems like you might be erring too far on the high dose, or you have to be eating such quantity that it's actually not even plausible to get it from plants. So it's kind of the best case. The best case, if you're very healthy, seems like you can't get enough, and the worst case, if you're not very healthy, is that you're already getting too much. At least that's the way it appears to be.
Oh man, Rhonda Patrick's gonna be sad to hear this. No, uh, she's crying over wherever she is. No, that's interesting. Yeah, so the hormetic stress, people should be familiar with that. But I mean, it's to have a little dose of something that's quote bad for you that causes a good result, I guess, is a simple way to put it. But yeah, that's interesting. So you're saying there is no kind of good benefit to eating the plants? Like, I mean, okay, maybe we should zoom out. Epidemiology of are plants healthy? Because I kind of see both sides of this too, and the healthy user bias, all this type of stuff. We'll zoom out and we'll zoom back in.
Sounds good.
Because health, like I said, plants are supposedly this panacea, right? It's gonna cure everything, and it's awesome. And also, I like this quote that you talk about and have presentations. Meat is food, plants are medicine. So that can kind of tie into this concept. So yeah, go for it.
Right. So yeah, there's some epidemiological evidence. I don't think it's actually all that strong, because when you're looking at epidemiology, you really need to see huge effects to consider that it might be causal, because there's so much interplay and all your variables are interdependent. But let's just suppose that we're going to take it at face value that epidemiology is showing that there is some benefit to eating more plants rather than not. Well, you've got to keep in mind that the data set on which that epidemiology is based is, there aren't any carnivores in that. Like, for one thing, right? All the people are on a, a grain-based diet, because that's the diet of modern civilization today, is a grain-based, high-carb diet. And so I think that what you're seeing when you look at people who are eating a high level of plants, it's not just the healthy user bias, but that is definitely something where people have been told that plants are healthy, and so the people who are eating more plants are the ones who are very conscientious and trying to do as much as they can to help their health. And so you've got to use their vegetable intake as a marker for a whole lifestyle that they're probably engaging in. But not only that, but you got to think about what the plants are replacing. So if the person who eats lower amounts of fruits and vegetables are eating higher amounts of, say, highly processed grains, then you can't necessarily say that it's the vegetables that are causing the 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 effect, because automatically when you take one thing away, you're adding something else. And so both things are candidates, either alone or separate, for the totality of the effect.
That's super important. I want to jump in because I wrote an article about this, that even fiber, like we think fiber is so great. And that is another nuanced topic, and we can get into later. Uh, I think fiber is just a proxy for eating less processed foods. It's like why we think fiber is so great, and it extends to just plant foods in general, is because it's, yes, exactly, a proxy for eating less processed food. It's what you're replacing with. And if you're eating, and I feel like my general thing is plants, like, you know, plants in a normal amount, in a reasonable way of eating them, are just neutral. I think your take is more that they're bad. My take is they're more neutral, and I think that animal foods are good. They're the beneficial ones. That's where we're getting all the good stuff. A lot of the plant stuff is like pretty neutral, and then it's just all the processed stuff is like negative, right? So it's like if you just look at it as that simple, then if you're getting rid of a lot of the negative stuff and you're just filling your plate with some more neutral stuff, then of course you're going to do better. But they're not. It's not magical. The plants aren't, you know, magical. They're just
Right.
neutral. They're cute.
Yeah,
They're
and I
there.
think actually I would tend to agree with you that for most people, and to a great degree, they actually are neutral. I think it's only for people who are having specific problems that the uh, that the plants are starting to become actually a detriment, which I didn't, when I first started carnivore, it really took me a long time to come to the realization that that could even be possible. I thought somehow I'm in better health despite the fact that I'm not eating vegetables. And it was only, as I said, after I heard Georgia Ede speaking, that I thought, oh, they could actually be causing me harm. It kind of blew my mind. But I think you're right that for most people, and especially in uh, reasonable amounts, whatever that means, that they
Mm-hmm.
are going to be neutral, and they add flavor and color, which is emotionally appealing, aesthetically appealing, and they they the fiber can be beneficial, but it's not necessarily. And I think there's this idea that you need to have plant fiber in your diet in order for your colon to work properly. And I just think that that's a little bit misguided for several reasons. One of them being the fact that there are many mammalian carnivores, and they have perfectly functioning, healthy colons without that. But there are other reasons too.
Well, no, let's talk about the fiber stuff because I've I think I think fiber is fine. I don't think it's necessary at all. It's like all these carnivores are proving it, right? And then I know that you can make these butyrates out of in these short what are they, the medium chain fatty acids, out of even collagenous bits out of meat. And there's other ways to feed your
Hmm.
gut, and you can get into that. But I think so. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's good if you're eating a more inclusive diet. It's good that you want to eat them in foods in their whole form, right? Like that's the point. I'm not saying you need fiber, but if you're gonna eat an apple, then eat the apple. Don't just drink the juice. And that you have some of these beneficial effects of keeping the food in its whole food matrix for just satiety and for maybe the insulin response and the blood, stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I think it's highly food dependent, and especially carbohydrate foods seem to have damaging effects when they are broken down to a certain degree. So, with the apple versus apple juice thing, you could make an argument where the spiking of blood sugar is a lot higher in the apple juice because the absorption rate is so much faster, and maybe there's a benefit from that. Whereas with something like starch, breaking if you break it up, there is a speed with the sugar, just like with the apple. But in addition to that, if you break it up far enough, you get these acellular um, level breakdown where there's at least some evidence that if you break the cell walls down in carbohydrates, they are more damaging somehow and are obesogenic in a way that I don't fully understand why. In a way that, for example, a protein you can break down and it doesn't seem to have that detrimental effect. So the degree of cutting um, seems to affect not just your speed of digestion, but actually what gets let into the past the intestinal barrier. Whereas I don't think there's any problem, for example, with a whey protein isolate. I don't think it has the same kind of detrimental effect that a really refined sugar would have. So I think that it's very food specific.
It is, and I did a long podcast with Gabor Dosi many years ago about
Yeah.
this, and yeah, he's great. I was just talking to him about coming back on, and yeah, no, it's definitely like the protein and the fat. You can kind of break it down, and it's fine. But the carbohydrate, once you get it out of its whole food matrix, the problems occur.
Yeah, and so that ties back to what you
So
said about fiber being a marker. So if you're looking at someone's diet and you just analyze out components like fiber, and you look at fiber as if it's an independent thing, and you say, oh, look, the people who are eating more fiber are healthier. Well, maybe it's not an effect of the fiber itself, but the fact that what they were eating was not broken down to the point that the fiber got removed.
exactly, that's my exact thing. Okay, but so what? Let's get back into the plant anti-nutrient realm, and maybe even what's it called? Well, the NRF pathway. I want to talk about that and antioxidants. Okay, yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Antioxidants and stuff, but aren't these good? So people would say, oh, but we need antioxidants and flavonoids, and there's all these studies that say these are so great.
Right.
So what about that?
So initially, people were kind of lumping together a whole bunch of different plant compounds as antioxidants because they were shown in the petri dish to have antioxidant activity. And that would include things that are true antioxidants like vitamin C or beta carotene or vitamin E, and also include things that aren't turn out not to be antioxidants, like the curcumin and quercetin and sulforaphane, but that end up having antioxidant activity. So what happens is with the true antioxidants, we've done some studies, and it turns out that they're not only not helpful for disease states, but there's at least a trend toward them being actually detrimental. So there are things, and I think it's because exactly that they interfere with oxidation. So there's this theory. that oxidative stress is the cause of disease and aging. But I think that that's actually backwards, because what happens is that oxidation is created during many processes in the body, and especially in metabolism. When we're generating ATP, there's this byproduct of a bit of oxidation. And maybe originally that was kind of a mistake, but once anything is the product of anything else biochemically, it becomes a signal. Because if ATP generation gives off reactive oxygen species, then the rest of the body can look at how much ROS is around. That gives us an indication of our metabolic state currently. So it turns out that oxidation is actually a powerful signaling mechanism for all kinds of processes in the body. And if you mess with that, it can cause a lot of problems. So normally what happens is this little bit of oxidation happens, and then immediately your body senses it and controls it, like any other process that you want to keep in strict bounds, like your blood sugar. Your amount of oxidation is kept by signals, including NRF2, which you mentioned, which has this role of uh, stimulating the body to generate its own antioxidants. And so that keeps it in a very strict balance. Now, if you throw a bunch of vitamin C at it, there are studies showing that, after exercise, you get all this oxidation that is actually part of the signal that tells your muscles to grow. And if you throw vitamin C at it, that signal is disrupted, and now you don't get the benefits of exercise that you were going to get. So there were many studies done trying to help disease by giving these true antioxidants like vitamin C, vitamin E, and beta carotene. And they actually stopped the studies because it seemed like it might actually be causing the diseases to get worse. And that's probably because you're interfering with a system that's doing a job that needs to be done. But then these other antioxidants, so-called antioxidants, the ones that we talked about earlier, the way that they're actually working is they're stimulating that immune response. They're activating NRF2. They're telling the body to generate its own antioxidants. And so the reason that we saw in a petri dish that they're causing antioxidation is because it's a cellular defense thing. But if you give too much, then the system gets overwhelmed and it's actually becomes a pro-oxidant. So there's a lot of confusion, and I think that even if you just randomly search the web today, you will find this confusion between antioxidants and things that are actually pro-oxidants that are being considered antioxidants, and people are really confused about what an antioxidant is and whether or not it's good. And it really isn't necessarily good to throw antioxidants at your system that it wasn't expecting.
I guess that goes back to just my general sense of ancestral health is just the human body expects what we find in nature. And when you start messing with it, it never really turns out well. But then I guess the counterpoint to that is that our modern society is toxic, and there's pollutants everywhere, and there's plastics and all this stuff going on. So I guess people say, well, we need more antioxidants and we need more of this to combat our modern world. What say you?
Yeah, I mean, we're really in a bind because both of those things are true. We are not in the environment that most of our adaptations were developed under. And so coming up with clever biohacks is, it's a great thing to do, and we need it. We need modern medicine, and we need to figure out how to cope with this environment, and we can't just wait for our bodies to come up, like let the people who don't survive die. That takes too long, and it's cruel. But on the other hand, we don't really know what we're doing. We're just playing around with ideas, models of the world that we have, and sometimes they're right, and sometimes, well, they're probably always right in some ways and wrong in other ways. Like any other scientific model, it's like the best idea we have, and it's wrong in some ways, but we don't know how. And so we have to we have to run with what we have, but we have to also keep this humility and watch out for unintended consequences.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's like doing it in too high amounts, like I did with like the oxalates. Or yeah, you have this good idea and then you take it too far. But what about? I'm sure there are stuff in the literature about. There are studies in the literature showing some of these benefits. I mean, and there's some that show not, like you mentioned. And I saw a video you did about. There's a study in 2002 about the removal of all high flavonoid plants reduce markers of oxidation. And so yeah, but I still have this idea that it could be good. Like I said, meat is food, plants are medicine. Like I still have this idea that plants are good, and that I think we have used them for medicines, like overtly just use them as medicine, but also, okay, I'll use this example. I eat a steak and it could get a little charred. And I think we have plenty of mechanisms that we've developed to make it so that these carcinogens or the heterocyclic amines or whatever these char things that our body can detoxify them. But maybe people eat steak with some herbs because maybe there is this counterbalancing effect to help us. But maybe that's just my wacky
I don't
theory.
think there's enough in the herbs to actually have that effect. At least looking through the data, I think maybe only a third of studies trying to show that plant intake of these flavonoids and so on actually have antioxidant effects. Only about a third of them had even positive outcomes. So that says to me that we don't quite understand enough of what's going on, or that it's at best an unreliable effect. And a lot of the ones that did have positive effects were in these isolate forms, like green tea was maybe half of the positive ones had to do with green tea. And green tea is something that you brew to get the most out of it, and you time it to get the time when it's got the most potent effect. And so it's like I drink coffee and I drink it. I like it, but the real reason is because I like the caffeine in it, right? And caffeine is a real drug. It's a real plant-based drug, and it has that effect. But I don't think I would get it from, um, you know, I'm not going to eat a a coffee berry to get that. I'm going to take all these steps to get this completely isolated away from the other parts of the plant, and to get that drug to the point that that I want it at an optimal point. And so maybe eating a little bit of rosemary with your lamb has some beneficial effect, but maybe it's just not enough. A lot of the studies that look at these compounds, like if you look at resveratrol, for example, the headlines say, "Oh, drink wine and it'll have this longevity effect," but it takes like 1,000 liters of wine to get enough resveratrol to have a clinical effect. Even I don't drink that much.
Well, it sounds like you're just advocating for like supplement, yeah, for like supplementing with high amounts of resveratrol, or so. What are you saying? Like, what is your point
Well,
about
I'm
that,
saying
though?
if you want to get the medicinal benefits, and that's playing around too, like we discussed, like maybe it's good, maybe it's going to have unintended outcomes, but maybe it's purely good. Like maybe taking that will actually improve your health and longevity. I don't know. But if you want to play with that, you're not going to get it from drinking wine. Like that's just an excuse. You're going to, if you want to,
Oh, I always say that.
right? Chocolate and wine and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
blueberries.
I never bought into that stuff. Like, oh, yeah, drink 2 to 3 glasses of wine a night for the benefits. I'm like, no, no, no. This is just mainstream media article headlines that make people, want to feed their, little alcohol thing they want to do
Yeah,
every night.
yeah. So I'm not saying necessarily that you should
Okay.
take resveratrol, but I'm saying if you want resveratrol, you should take the supplement, not drink the wine. Well, you can do both if you want, but you need the supplement to get the clinical dose.
Yeah. Have we exhausted plant stuff yet? I mean, we can talk about other anti-nutrients. Some people find success. We talked about nightshades, removing them, lectins. maybe just go into some more
Yeah,
anti-nutrient
so
stuff
an
before we
important
move
one
on.
is phytates. Phytates interfere with absorption of nutrients and minerals. If you look at the initiative that we have for poorer countries where we're trying to find fortification solutions because we see a lot of people with malnutrition. If you look at the studies behind what needs to be fortified and why, almost all of the things like iron and zinc, vitamin A, all of these things come from phytates interfering with the ability of those nutrients to be absorbed in the right amount. So you may have seen there's an especially talked about study where they gave people oysters for the zinc and they measured the zinc levels in their blood and soon after they ate the oysters the blood levels go way up. But if they had them with corn tortillas at the same time, it's the zinc level just stays on the floor. It just never gets there. And so the the takeaway from all of those things is that diets that are really high in grains and legumes have so much phytate content that it it drives up the RDAs basically. You need to get a whole bunch more nutrition just to overcome the interference and absorption from the phytates in these plants. So I think that's one that we don't really talk about that much but is really important.
It is important. And so I don't know if people have heard about this a million times or they're new to this, but yes, these plant anti-nutrients block nutrient absorption. That's one of the main problems, other than maybe irritating your gut or going through your gut, like permeability, intestinal permeability. But a lot of people don't realize this is just sort of basic science that no one really talks about, and it kind of goes against all the mainstream narratives. But that and it gets into the RDAs too, which is good to talk about, because one of my big questions about carnivore is, well, what about not getting all the nutrients? And well, I guess maybe we don't need all of them if we're not eating all these grains. But well, yeah, what is your take on that? Because it's a big
Yeah, I
topic.
actually wrote a paper on that and I've given a presentation about RDAs specifically. And it turns out that the there are many different things that can have an effect on how much of a nutrient you need. So absorption is a big one, and that's going to have an effect on zinc, for example, that we already talked about. So if the difference between how much zinc a vegetarian needs versus a grain-based omnivore, I think is like a vegetarian needs something like 50% more. So even though we don't have a quantitative measure of how much zinc someone who doesn't eat any grains at all needs, one can imagine that if the difference between just an omnivore and a vegetarian is that big, how much if you took away all grains, um, I think that it's very plausible that our zinc needs are going to be less. Then there are metabolic things. So when you're on a ketogenic diet, for example, there's this thing that happens where thyroid hormones don't have to work as hard because T3 is actively it's completely interdependent on how much carbohydrate you're metabolizing. So there are many studies that show that if you fast or go on a low carbohydrate diet, your T3 levels go down, but it's not in a pathological way. So you don't develop hypothyroid symptoms. You simply need less T3. And most important thing that iodine is needed for is because it's a component of T3. And so if your T3 levels are lower, so you're being more efficient in the way that you use thyroid in that way, it stands to reason that your iodine levels, your need for iodine is also going to go down. There's actually it's a hypothesis paper for medical hypotheses, so it's not you can't prove it. But his idea was that in the past, before we had our modern agriculture-based diet with lots of grains, that our need for iodine was actually lower, and that the reason that we see so much iodine deficiency now is actually a product of our high grain diet. And then there are also, let's talk about vitamin C, because vitamin C, it comes up all the time in the context of a carnivore diet, because if you look at run the gamut of all of the essential vitamins and minerals that people need, and you look at the sources that you can get from animal source food versus plant food, meat turns out it wins almost every time. So it's more bioavailable, and it's easy to get, and there's more of it for most vitamins that we need. But vitamin C really stands out as one that it's not in high quantity in meat. Actually, a lot of people think that meat doesn't have vitamin C at all, and I blame the USDA for that, because they have this database where you look up what's in different foods, and if you look up beef, it says 0 for vitamin C. But you have to follow all the little footnotes to find out that the reason it says 0 is because they didn't measure it. For some reason, they considered it wouldn't be an important source, or maybe I'm speculating as to why they didn't bother to measure it and they just put 0 for that. Meat does have vitamin C, and it has, if you're eating a carnivore diet, you're eating a lot more meat than someone who's eating a diet with a lot of other things in it. And the amount of vitamin C that would be in that meat, provided you don't cook it to well done every time, because that will destroy some of the vitamin C, is actually enough to hit the anti-scorbutic dose. So you won't get scurvy. There's enough to prevent scurvy, but it's kind of borderline edgy. And so I've always been a little bit curious about why we don't hear stories about people on the carnivore diet developing scurvy. You should develop scurvy within a month of a vitamin C free diet, because we're highly unusual. Most animals synthesize their own vitamin C, and we don't. But I've heard almost 0 cases of symptoms of scurvy developing on a carnivore diet. And so I started looking into why that might be. And one thing that I found out was that we all know that vitamin C, or maybe you know that vitamin C is really instrumental in forming collagen. And so one of the big symptoms of scurvy, once it's gotten quite far developed, is like the whole tooth falling out thing, where your tissues just aren't staying together because you don't have the collagen to be able to repair, so you bruise easily. But what's less known is that vitamin C is also really important in the synthesis of carnitine. And carnitine is essential for fatty acid metabolism. In order to get fatty acids into the mitochondria to burn, they need to be transported by carnitine. And so if you're low in carnitine, it disrupts your ability to burn fat, and that can make you really, really tired. And it turns out that the first symptom of scurvy, long before we get to tooth falling out stage, is fatigue. And it also turns out that it's been known for centuries that fresh meat cures scurvy. And it seems really odd that a food that sort of barely has enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy in the best case scenario would be known for actually curing it. And it turns out that meat is so high in carnitine, and carnitine, unlike collagen, when you eat carnitine, it gets taken right up. So you can use the carnitine from your food in your metabolism. And eating carnitine actually can stave off scurvy even when vitamin C levels are lower than you might otherwise expect it to be. Carnitine is really important on a ketogenic diet of any flavor because of that role that it plays in fat metabolism.
All right, we're back. We cut out a little bit, but we were talking about the vitamin C stuff in meat. And yeah, I was just thinking about how we figured out about scurvy with the people on the ships, and they couldn't get fresh meat. And so they couldn't get vitamin C. But if you did have fresh meat, you could get vitamin C or all the carnitine you were talking about. So I guess it makes sense why they didn't test for it, because they just assumed that maybe meat doesn't have vitamin C because of scurvy stories. I don't know.
Yeah, it's really strange to me, because it's been known for so long that meat cures scurvy. And then when we found out that vitamin C is the thing that's missing when um, scurvy happens, but then meat doesn't have all that much vitamin C, so I feel like I kind of feel like it just didn't fit in the story, and so they kind of forgot about the historical context of that. And it's really interesting that carnitine could be the factor that is preventing scurvy in these cases, even though scurvy can be induced by vitamin C deficiency. It might actually largely be a carnitine deficiency. You can think of it that way because that's when the first symptoms come, and once you get carnitine, then even a small amount of vitamin C can take care of your collagen needs, and your carnitine's already taken care of.
Wow. Well, finish your thoughts on the ketogenic diet too, and your differing needs for carnitine and all that, and nutrients in general.
Sure, yeah. So we talked about some things where the RDA or the nutrient need that you have when you're on a ketogenic diet might actually be lower because you don't have these interferences, and you may have these physiological reasons that your needs would be lower. But carnitine is one example where, because a ketogenic diet is so much more geared toward burning fat, and because you need carnitine in the mitochondria to be able to burn fat, your needs for carnitine might even be higher. So it doesn't always work in our favor, and you might want to be mindful of that if you're going on a ketogenic diet to make sure that you're getting enough carnitine, which is of course not a problem that you need to worry about when you're on an all meat diet.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get more into the meat stuff. So I don't know if we should talk about mTOR first, or yeah, let's just go there. Walter Longo. He's kind of this figure that really annoys me because he's just well known in this longevity community. But again, longevity is sort of this unknown theoretical thing anyway, right? No one knows the outcomes of anything. So what do you think about this whole mTOR discussion? Because they're saying that if you eat too much meat, you're gonna stimulate mTOR.
Yeah, well, it's true, but not exactly true. So Longo, I feel like his where he's coming from is he has all these reasons to believe that a plant-based high carb diet would be the healthiest diet. Um, I don't believe that. But without going into that, suppose that you did believe that, but you also had a whole bunch of research that you had conducted that proved to you that a ketogenic diet, not necessarily ketogenic diet, but getting into a state of ketosis is having an effect on all these biological markers that should improve longevity. Your only way, if you think that a ketogenic diet itself is not healthy as a long-term lifestyle, the only way out of that dilemma is to say, okay, eat your plant-based diet, and then from time to time, go into deep ketosis so you can get those benefits on a repeated level. And so that's where he has gotten his program where he says, eat this high-carb plant-based diet, and then once a month or whatever it is, fast for 3 to 5 days so that you can inhibit mTOR to the point where we're going to see these markers that should probably be associated with longevity. So I can understand where he's coming from, but to me it's also kind of frustrating because it's just so obvious. Well, why don't you just go on a ketogenic diet and have that benefit all the time? Um, and I feel that for him it must be that he just can't get on board with a ketogenic diet as being healthy long term. But
Well,
one one thing that's interesting
well,
about
he
that,
can't get up. Okay, keep going.
we've got a little delay. One thing
Yeah,
that's
it's okay.
interesting about
Keep
that
going.
is that um, if you're coming from a high carb diet and you want to get to the point where your mTOR is inhibited to the levels that seem like it would correspond to the longevity benefits, you have to fast for days on end because you have to keto adapt. And if you're already on a ketogenic diet, then you don't need that long keto adaptation period. So I don't think that it makes sense. If you're on a ketogenic diet, I don't think there's any reason to fast for 3 to 5 days. Like that magic 3 to 5 days is probably not going to be the case if you're already on a ketogenic diet, because mTOR itself, um, it will inhibit ketosis. So if you're in ketosis, that's an indication that your mTOR is relatively inhibited. But when you eat protein, that is going to bump your mTOR, and you need mTOR because mTOR is responsible for growth. You wouldn't want to be in a situation where your mTOR is always down, because then you wouldn't be able to grow. You wouldn't have the brain and cognitive benefits that come with all those growth factors. Ideally, you want some kind of alternation where you go like into a high growth phase, and then you go into a low, like a catabolic phase where you're releasing all kinds of energy and getting all of these factors, including ketosis and inhibition of mTOR. But if you're on that high carb situation, the swing takes a long time. But if you're already on a ketogenic diet and then you eat 2 pounds of steak, yeah, that's going to stimulate mTOR, but the amount of time, if you're coming from an already ketogenic state, that it's going to take for that to then deplete again and put you in this place where you're in the type of metabolism that's associated with all that longevity stuff, is going to be quick. So if you're on a carnivore diet, you're not necessarily going to be in the level of ketosis that you are fasting, because that's about as high ketogenic as you can get, unless you add fat on top of that, and then it's even more ketogenic. But you're going to be at a level of ketosis where that perturbance, when you eat your very high protein and hopefully also high fat meal, only gives that bolus, that spike, for a short period of time, and you go to bed. By the time you wake up in the morning, you're already back in a fairly high ketogenic state. And so I would argue that the the detriment of having protein in terms of its mTOR hit is actually just small and temporary, and the benefit of it for your growth and your health are enough to warrant doing it anyway. So I mean, you need to maintain your muscle mass also if you're worried about longevity. So there, you wouldn't want to be in this state where you're constantly depriving yourself of protein. I don't think that supports health at all.
Yeah, that's a good breakdown of it. And I don't think he considers that. It's like, yeah, do you want to be in this, like, just be a shriveled old person that could fall and break their hip? And then it's like, oh, I'm living forever. But maybe not. Maybe you die way earlier because you fall and break your hip. Or maybe you do live 2 years longer than me, but you're this frail, like weak person that that isn't living. So there's a lot to that. Also, yeah, I think there's other ways to stimulate mTOR too. It's like I don't think I think if you eat a good diet, and it doesn't have to be carnivore, but if you're sort of like this well thought out kind of diet where you're not eating meat. It's not like we're just eating meat every 4 hours and having these constant mTOR
Right.
spikes. That the net benefit that other diets, especially standard American diets or these high carb diets, that you could be having more mTOR
Right. So
spikes.
insulin is one of the things that is going to heavily influence mTOR. And so if you're eating a diet that is stimulating insulin all the time, even if you're not eating meat, it's not necessarily going to put you in this mTOR inhibition situation either.
Yeah, and another thing, it's so sad that this plant-based paradigm has just taken over, because I could see this cognitive dissonance with people like Walter Longo. There's other people. I've talked to all kinds of different scientists that they're so conflicted because they know, even anthropologists are studying meat eating throughout history, but they're like, but we do need, the whole grains are good and we need a balanced diet and all that. And it's so sad because they have this idea that we have to be eating this whole grain diet with all the plants, even though they know throughout history we didn't do that. And so if these guys like Walter Longo could just see that, he wouldn't have such a a weird solution to the problem.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Well, okay. And also he brings I like that kind of point you brought up. I call it longevity mode versus growth mode. So you're talking about these two states. And so growth mode, you do need the growth mode, and then you also need the longevity mode. And you just have to be thoughtful about it. And I'm trying to formulate my idea of the best diet, right? And everyone can formulate their own idea, but my current thinking around it is I do eat sort of like high fat, low carb lunch, and I want to extend this longevity mode, and then I work out in the evening and then have more protein and maybe some fruit after dinner. And I do want some mTOR. I want to stimulate some growth. I'm like, yeah, I'm building my muscles, let's do this. But it's for this short window, right? And then and I'm not eating like a bowl of pasta, right? I'm eating, a bit of fruit or maybe a little bit some sweet potatoes. And so I'm like, yeah, I'm getting some good growth, and then I'm not, and then I'm back into longevity mode.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if you're especially if you're in a healthy metabolic state, you don't necessarily need to do an extra long longevity mode. I call it the energy mode because you're releasing energy from various stores. But it obviously if you're in a metabolic state where you're not very healthy and you need more of that breakdown phase, maybe those need to be longer, or maybe a low carb diet that's perpetual will serve you. But if you're in a very healthy state where your energy flux is working the way it's supposed to be, I don't think there's any good evidence that having some carbohydrates and insulin stimulation in a pulsed way, not a continuous way, but in a more of a strategic way, that I don't think there's any reason to think that that should be unhealthy, as long as you're getting both phases.
Hmm. That's where I'm at. Well, here's a question to you. I don't know if you want to be in this constant ketogenic state, or this constant longevity state. What do you think?
Well,
I mean, I think there's a few problems even with like blood sugar. Like I've talked to a lot of people about the CGM stuff, blood sugar, and you can see, and fasting, glucose levels and stuff. And if people are on these maybe carnivore or too low carb diets for too long, it kind of just keeps rising and rising, and maybe that's not good.
I think that if you are under eating for long periods, that is a problem. So if if your ketogenic diet is one that is caloric restricted or fat restricted, so it, it can it's not going to serve your health long term because you do need those growth phases. If you're in a high nutrition maintenance kind of mode with a ketogenic diet where you're definitely getting all the nutrition you need and all the energy that you need, I don't I don't see that being associated with any sort of problem. The high glucose thing has been kind of a mystery. It doesn't happen to everybody, and it seems to me that it's happening mostly with people who are very lean and especially if they don't eat a very high fat diet, so they're more toward the protein side. It looks to me like it's actually an energy rescue function where you're you're not getting enough fat from your fat stores, from the combination of your fat stores and your diet. And so your glucose is sort of rising in a compensatory way. Whereas people who are eating they're either still fat, and so they have enough fat on their body that the rate of fat out of their adipose tissue is keeping the fat at a high level in the bloodstream, or if you're leaner and you're eating a much higher amount of fat and you're not bringing your protein levels way up to try to use protein for energy, those people their glucose levels tend to stay low in the like 70 to 90 range and don't go up to the like 100 range where some people who are really lean and are eating low fat are starting to see.
Mm. All right, so two more questions. Penultimate question. What about the high protein versus high fat? Because I know you did a podcast with our good pal, Dr. Ted Naiman, and
Yeah,
he's kind of on the high protein side and you're on the high fat side. You did a
yeah.
presentation called the Lipivore, which I love the idea that we were just fat hunters. And I did a podcast with Mickey Bendor about that and all that stuff. But yeah, high fat or high protein?
Well, I think almost all keto and carnivore diets are already, even ones that are considered high protein, are usually actually already high fat. So high protein to me would be if you're getting, um, I hate to talk about it in terms of calories, but just for a moment, like more than 30% or up toward 30% protein would be more of a high protein approach. But you can actually scale it back to something like even 15%. That should be so high that you're still in nitrogen balance, but not much more. And so the difference that we're talking about is actually fairly small. Um, if you if you are very metabolically healthy, and you fast, for example, or you eat a lot of protein and a small amount of fat, you should be able to access your fat stores in a really efficient way such that you don't have to use protein for energy and you can use fat for energy because of both ends are working. And when I say both ends, I mean your adipose is willingly letting go of the fat so that it's available, and your fatty acid oxidation system is working really well so you can use that fat for energy. And if you have any problem with either side of those, it's going to feel to your body like you can't get enough energy. So if you fast, a lot of people that are healthy, when they fast, they actually feel better than they did when they were eating. They get this burst of energy, they feel euphoria, and feel really, really good. And that to me indicates that their fat metabolism is ramped up in a really good way and they're getting everything that they need. They feel energetic. But if you fast and you feel cold and hungry and tired and brain fog, that's an indication that even if you're fat, for whatever reason, either your adipose tissue is not willing to give it up, or you have some impairment in your ability to burn fat efficiently. That's a situation where um, fasting or a high protein, low fat approach is unlikely to be helpful and may actually be harming you. So if you try a high protein approach and it feels good, then then that whole idea of the fat that you eat is displacing the fat that you could be taking from your body seems to more or less make sense. But if you have some kind of problem in releasing fat or using fat, and you try a high protein diet, it's not going to make you feel good, and in fact, it's not going to help you lose weight because the whole problem is that you're having problems with fat burning. And to be concrete about it, a problem that would indicate low release could be related to something like lipedema, where the fat tissue is not healthy and is not releasing fat in the normal way. It could just have to do with hyperinsulinemia from being maybe from having a history of diabetes. And the insulin, often when you go on a low carb diet, diabetes problems that have to do with glucose quickly resolve, but the basal insulin level takes a long time to come down. And if your insulin is higher, it's going to affect your ability to get fat from your fat storage, but it's also going to affect your ability to burn fat. And it seems to be that people with those conditions, and maybe other people too, it's not just them, but if you put them on a just adequate protein and then fill in the rest of the calories with fat, adding that fat actually seems to be better for health and even for weight loss than if you didn't add the fat in the first place. And I think that's because it's stimulating from a hormonal level the release of fat and the use of fat in the body. So I can't completely explain it, but what I've just seen in anecdotes is that some people lose more fat by adding more fat as long as their protein isn't very high. And I think that that's consistent with what Finney has seen in the Virta Health Initiative. Now, that's specifically a population of people who have a history of diabetes. So I'm really, I really think that we need a lot more study, and I don't mind people doing different approaches and pointing out that it works really well for them. I'm all for that. Um, but what really bothers me is when people say you can't lose weight by adding more fat, because it's simply from observation not true. Some people do way better on high fat than on high protein.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's so many different circumstances and everyone's different. And yeah, well, it just goes against, I think people push back at it because it goes against the calorie balance model or
Yeah.
something. They think it doesn't make sense. Like, burn your own body fat. Don't, and I get that take too, right? It's like you have your own body fat to burn, so don't take in exogenous fat so you can burn your body fat. I get it. But I also get that a calorie is not a calorie. And this whole calorie balance thing is like a huge rabbit hole to go down. And that I've done that on many other podcasts. So I'll leave it at that for now. And I'll do my hardest question for last because
Uh-oh.
it's how we do it around here. So I worry about the carnivore community just being too much like the vegan community, where in the vegan community they say, "Oh, I'm getting all my nutrients, I'm all good," until they're not good, and then 5 years down the line, they kind of deplete all their nutrient stores, and then they have the problems. So, what about that for carnivores? Maybe they feel great at the time, but you're slowly depleting certain nutrients by not eating them.
I mean, that's certainly possible. There are some nutrients are more stored than others. So we talked about how vitamin C, a deficiency in vitamin C should show up within about a month normally. But the problems that vegans would be facing might be, for example, vitamin B12, which can take years and years and years to show up. So partly it's a function of what the vitamins at stake are and how they operate, and what it looks like to have a mild deficiency, because maybe a mild deficiency is something that other things would compensate for, or you might not notice, uh, especially if it's something gradual. I think many of us have had the experience where we've had a gradual decline in something and not really noticed how bad it was until we fixed it. And then we're like, oh my God, I feel so much better. I didn't realize how bad it was. I think we should keep our minds open to that, but I'm not sure what vitamins it would be. And we're not completely free of data. So there are like random people who have done the diet for a long time, but we also have, for example, the Bellevue studies from the explorer Stephenson, Vilhjalmur Stephenson, who he spent time in the Arctic with Inuit, and when he came home and claimed that eating no plants made him feel better than he'd ever felt in his life, people didn't like that and kind of challenged him. And so he agreed to do a study where there was a couple months in a metabolic ward and then the rest of the year at home. And they tested for vitamin deficiencies, and they didn't find vitamin deficiencies. So we're not completely in a vacuum on whether an all meat diet would create a deficiency, but 1 year is just 1 year, and like you said, like it could be a much longer time frame. I think we definitely have to keep an open mind for that. Where I'm coming from is when I think about that is the plausibility. If we look at the different vitamins and think about, is it plausible that we could have a deficiency, and what what we should be looking for in case that comes up. And um, I don't know. I feel pretty confident that partly because of this historical and ethnographic data, that people many peoples have lived without much plant um, intake in their diet, like not just the Inuit who have a kind of special situation where the foods that they eat in the Arctic are really quite different from if just eating ribeye every day. And ribeye every day is not really found anywhere, to be really clear. But we do have societies like the Mongolians who, before the introduction of grains, ate hardly any plants. They're pastoral living, so they have like sheep and herding animals, and that was the mainstay of their diet. And I think that historically we can agree that Genghis Khan was a badass who wasn't in any kind of health trouble. Um, but no, I think it's a fair point. We ought to be careful and open-minded and not just dismiss anything that comes up as impossible or an outlier, because that's where it's going to come up, right? You're in this community, and then 10 years later, people start falling, and we make excuses one by one instead of seeing at what point do you see, okay, this is actually a real picture that's forming. And um, it's hard because if you feel better than you've ever felt, then it's hard to imagine that there could be some small piece that's not in place.
That makes sense. So it sounds like, is that where you are, where you're just feeling great and you're not looking for anything more, and you're just like, well, unless something happens, I'm sticking with it.
Yep.
All right. Well, that's great. No, cool. Yeah. I mean, everyone's got to do their own experiment. Yeah. If you're feeling great and yeah, you're not, your teeth aren't falling out, then why not?
I mean, it's sort of like the thing we were talking about earlier with long-term ketogenic diets or low-carb diets. There was a long time, I think, where people would say, yeah, it's good for weight loss, but it has long-term problems, like maybe it's bad for heart disease, and you don't want to do that long term. And there's definitely a set of people who are saying, like, what alternative do I have? Am I going to go back to eating high carbs because I'm worried about my heart and become, visibly fatter and in a higher risk group for heart disease, among other things? I definitely don't want to ever go back to a mood disorder problem. So there may be a time in the future where I decide I'm going to figure out some ways to incorporate some plants in my diet, but I'm never going to go back to a diet that where I was chronically ill.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes sense. All right. Thank you so much for this conversation. We're running out of time here. Where can people find you?
I hang out way too much on Twitter, so you can find me there. Keto Carnivore is my handle, my main handle.
Awesome. I'll link to that in the show notes, and I will see you at a conference soon, I'm sure.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me on.
Awesome. Okay. Take care.